ASP.NET Core provides a complete control of how individual requests are handled by your web application. The startup class is the entry point to your application. It's utilized for setting up configuration and wiring up services the application will use. Developers can also configure a request pipeline in the startup class that is used to handle all of the requests made by the application. So the Startup.CS class, as you can see right here on our .NET Core project, can optionally accept dependencies in its constructor passed through via dependency injection. As you can see right here, we have the iHosting environment type, provides information about web hosting environment for the application that is running in. And as you can see, we can pass to the environmental type and detect whether it's in development mode or not. And we can build our configuration to associate in our constructor. So as you can see right here, we're setting the base path associated with our hosting environment to the content root path, and we're adding JSON files to associate our different configuration settings to add the environmental variables, and then we're building a configuration based on this configuration builder. So this is what we're injecting inside of our startup.cs file inside of its constructor. You also have, besides the constructor, you can utilize the configure services and the configure method. Now the configure method is required by your application. This method is used to configure the HTTP request pipeline. So the configure method is used to specify how ASP.NET Core will respond to HTTP requests. At its simplest, you can configure every request to receive the same response. There's a lot of complex sets of pipeline configuration that can be encapsulated in middleware and added and used using extensions like the iApplication Builder. There's required parameters inside of your configure method. You have the iApplication Builder type. This defines a class that provides a mechanism to configure your application's pipeline. You can also pass the parameters as we did before in our constructor for its hosting environment. You can represent a type used to configure a logging system and create instances of the iLogger for requested iLogger providers. And inside of this, you're configuring your pipeline to associate logging here using application insights telemetry to associate. If your application is in development mode, you can use a developer exception page and use the browser link. But if you're in your production environment, you actually can configure an error page to associate to the user. We're also configuring in our pipeline to allow static files so we can read from the www root folder all of these different files and folders associated inside of here. And we're configuring MVC inside of our configure services method. This middleware is essential to initiate the different request pipeline to associate inside of your project. Now, before we implement the configure method, we can also call this to add services to the container. We have the configure services method right here. The configure services method is a public method on your startup class that takes an iService collection instance. Inside of the configure services method, this is where you can configure the services to associate inside of your application. So in this case, in future lectures, we will add to the service context our DB context to associate with EF Core. We'll also add different services associated with sending emails to its interface type, to its actual type. So we can add application services. We can also configure, as we have here, add MVC. So this is going to allow MVC services to be specified by the iService collection. This allows us to implement dependency injection for the different types we have inside of our application. So the configure services is associated with dependency injection and injecting that services to allow its use. And the configure method is the actual configuration for the request pipeline itself. So you inject the services you want in your application in your configure services, and then you utilize how you want to configure those services associated in your configure method. So the iApplication Builder type is used to build application request pipeline. The iHosting provides the current environment, content path, web root file provider. The iLogger provides a mechanism for creating loggers. And the iService collection is the current set of services configured in a container. This is only available in your configure services method. So this is our startup.cs file. And to recap, we can inject services inside of the constructor associated with building configuration in our hosting environment. In the configure services method, we configure what services we want to allow inside of our ASP.NET Core application. In the configure method, we actually configure what type of HTTP request pipeline we want to associate with those services that we injected in the configure services method. Remember that in ASP.NET Core, the Startup.CS file is required. Without this, there is no entry point emitted into your application.